Okay, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Janet Ng, Hearing Officer for San Francisco Public Works. Kim Stevens is the clerk of the hearing this morning. This hearing is being recorded and a sign-in sheet is at the table at the front. So please be sure to sign in for our records and so that if necessary, we can contact you in the future regarding the item you are here for. This public hearing is being held to consider one item, order number 201355, to consider protests filed with respect to the issuance of tentative approvals for the following applications for personal wireless service facility site permits. 18WR-0340 at 3360 Sacramento Street, 18WR-0402 at 775 Frederick Street, 18WR-0430 at 230 Franklin Street, 19WR-00024 at 2736 Broderick Street, 19WR-00048 at 345 Spear Street, and 19WR-00041 at 1201 Alamany Boulevard. My job as a hearing officer is to gather the facts for the hearing items, listen to your testimony, and help the Director of Public Works make determinations. I will not be making any decisions today. Instead, I will forward the findings from this hearing and make my recommendations to the Director. The Director will make the final determinations. When the Director's determinations are made, the Department will notify you of them. Therefore, if you want to be notified, please sign in. This hearing will proceed as follows. I will ask Public Works staff to speak first, present the item, give us an overview of the permit application process, and describe how the applications arrived at today's hearing. Afterwards, I will have the speakers in the following order. I will ask that protesters that submitted written comments to speak next. Anyone supporting the protesters will speak following that. Then I will give the applicant a chance to speak and to answer any of the protesters' comments. Anyone supporting the applicant will speak next. And lastly, any city agency, including Public Works, can speak and comment on any of the speakers. Each speaker will have up to 3 minutes to speak. The clerk will monitor the time for all speakers. When you hear the first bell, it will mean that the speaker has 30 seconds left to speak. A louder second bell will signal that the time is up. Please clearly state your name into the microphone before you start. Comments and questions should be addressed to me and not to the department or to the applicant. If you cannot finish your comments within the allotted time, you can submit written testimony to me at the end of this hearing. If I feel that questions are warranted, I will ask questions. After all comments are completed, I will close the item. So let's begin the hearing. So order number 201355, may I have Public Works?
Lulu Bryan with San Francisco Public Works. Good morning, my name is Lulu Bryan, and I'll be giving an overview of the wireless permitting process. The city has limited authority over personal wireless service facilities. Wireless facilities are regulated at the federal level with limited local control, allowing some oversight of design. All authority invested to the city regarding these facilities is restricted to Public Works Code Article 25 and Public Works Order 184504. The process includes review by San Francisco Public Works, the Planning Department, and the Health Department. If all departments recommend approval of the application, the city issues a tentative approval, and the applicant posts and mails this notice to any person owning property or living within 150 feet of this facility. There is a 20-day protest period, and if Public Works receives an objection to this notice, as we have for the applications on today's agenda, Public Works convenes a hearing. We have provided the hearing officer, the Planning Department, and the Health Department with all of the objections. Additionally, the applicant has responded to each protest. Public Works Code Article 25, Section 1513, which I have here, provides all the available grounds the city can lawfully use to deny a wireless permit. The first ground is if the Health Department incorrectly determines that the application meets Article 25's health compliance standard. This would mean that the facility would not comply with the Federal Communication Commission's emissions guidelines. The second ground is if the Planning Department incorrectly determined that the application meets tier compatibility standards. This would mean that the facility would significantly detract from the defining characteristics of the adjacent neighborhood. The fourth and fifth grounds is if Article 25's requirements for obtaining a wireless permit are not being fulfilled, or that there's a proposed modification to the design and that modification would not comply with Article 25 standards. For all the applications on today's agenda, we believe the tentative approval was issued correctly. The Health Department found that all applications meet Article 25's health standard, and under federal law, the city cannot deny an application for emission concerns if the facility is found to meet FCC guidelines. Additionally, the Planning Department found that all applications meet the tier standards and will not significantly detract from the defining characteristics of the adjacent neighborhoods. Finally, there's no evidence in Public Works possession that demonstrates that these applications will not comply with Article 25 and Order 184504 standards and requirements. We'll be here for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So application number 18WR-0340 at 3360 Sacramento Street. Do we have any protesters who would like to speak on this item? Do we have the applicant here who would like to speak?
Hi, my name is Laurel Ferguson. I'm a consultant for AT&T who helps with the filing and subsequent hopeful approvals of AT&T's proposed wireless service sites throughout the city of San Francisco. We agree with the city's determination that we meet all Article 25 as well as Department of Public Health and FCC requirements for our proposed permit, and we would like for the city to deem this facility approved and provide a final determination.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have anyone else who'd like to speak on this? Okay, moving on to the next one, permit number 18WR-0402 at 775 Frederick Street. Do we have any protesters who would like to speak on this item? Do we have the applicant who would like to speak?
Hi, my name is Laurel Ferguson. I represent AT&T for wireless facilities in San Francisco for these small cell works, and we believe that the city's determination for tentative approval was justly given, and we believe that we should receive a final determination. Do you have any questions for our application?
I do not. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Okay. Moving on to the next item, 18WR-0430 at 230 Franklin Street. Do we have any protesters who would like to speak on this item?
Morning, I'm Maurice Fitzgerald. I live at 1427 Bay Street, and my first point is that no one in my neighborhood is aware that this is even happening. This light pole is not going on Franklin Street. It's going on Bay Street on Octavia and Bay. And when I canvassed the neighborhood, everybody told me, no, that's going on Franklin Street. So I don't think we were given adequate notice. I think there are a number of neighbors who have a problem with this pole. When I talked to them yesterday, they did not set aside time to come here today because they simply didn't know. It's misleading. It's not on Franklin Street. It's actually several blocks away at Bay and Octavia. My understanding is that they utilize the address of Fort Mason, which is enormous. So it could be anywhere on Fort Mason. So it's very difficult for people to determine where this actual antenna is. The other point I'd like to make is that this is going to be a replacement of an existing pole, and the existing pole essentially matches other existing poles going down Bay Street. It's sort of a concrete-looking pole, and should this permit be approved, I just want to make sure that that pole is doesn't look any different than the poles that are all the way down Bay Street, which have more of a historic look to them. I look directly at this light pole right out my window. It's about 75 feet away from my children and me. I have two young boys, 5 and 6, and my wife, and it's in our living room. So essentially, this is going to be an aesthetic concern for us. As far as the RF implications here, the permit suggests that there was a report done that shows it's 0.4 something percent of the allowed RF frequency, and I would like to hear a clarification. Does that mean less than 1% of the allowed, or is it 43% of the allowed? It's not entirely clear. So those are the points that I wanted to make here today.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other protesters who would like to speak on this item? Is the applicant here who would like to speak on this item?
Good morning, Melanie Sengupta, outside counsel for Verizon Wireless. As you know, this is part of a long-standing program in San Francisco. Verizon and other wireless carriers have worked with planning, DPW, DPH, the Department of Technology, PUC, the Historic Preservation Commission, MTA, and other city agencies to develop the current design. This is the pole that we are talking about today. So this is what the pole looks like existing, and this is what it looks like with the small cell wireless facility on it. There are two main things that the city reviews these applications for under Article 25. The first is with respect to radio frequency emissions. As DPW staff told you, the FCC has primary jurisdiction over radio frequency emissions and establishes the emission exposure levels. They work with the EPA, FDA, the National Institutes of Health, and other federal agencies to make sure that these exposure levels are set appropriately. The city's job under Article 25 is to make sure that the facility complies with those FCC standards. Article 25 requires Verizon to hire a third-party RF consultant to prepare a report on RF emissions. We have Daniel Rowe of Hammett and Edison here today to answer any questions related to RF emissions. After that, DPH's RF engineer reviews the report and submits a document, a determination to DPW, determining whether or not the proposed facility complies with the FCC standards. Here they did, and the protester raised a question about what some of the numbers in the report mean. This is a low wattage facility. It's 110 watts, and so the maximum calculated exposure level at the nearest building is 0.43% of the FCC standard. So that's less than 1%. On the ground anywhere, it's 0.055%. So these are very low-powered facilities with very low emissions, and Mr. Rowe can speak further to any additional questions you have on that topic. Planning also reviews the application with respect to aesthetics. They review both the district itself and whether there are any special considerations. For instance, here it is in a historic district, and planning reviewed the site under the relevant criteria under Article 25 and found that such a small facility as the one you can see here wouldn't have any impact. Another question that the protester raised was the noticing address. Unfortunately, the poles aren't assigned addresses, and planning instructs Modus to use the closest parcel here. That's 230 Franklin Street, and Modus is here to show the full radius of addresses that they noticed. With respect to the pole, there was questions about whether the pole will look like the other poles in the area. This will be a replacement pole, and SFPUC is the party who owns the pole, and they dictate whether or not the pole will be replaced. SFPUC, as I understand it, only has 2 pole designs which accommodate both their facilities and these wireless facilities, so they have chosen the pole that will be used at this facility. Did you have any questions for me?
I do not. The question maybe for your engineer regarding the percentages. Maybe he can describe or discuss
Sure.
that a little bit more.
He's heading right on up.
Daniel Rowe with Hammett and Edison. Our firm prepared the ARF report. I understand you have questions.
Yes, so one of the protesters talked about the question of the percentages. He mentioned 0.4%, and I believe Melanie talked about it's 0.4% of the FCC standard. Can you discuss what that means?
Sure. So the FCC sets standards for emission limits based on the frequency that each carrier operates at. And the percent that we report in our report is the maximum cumulative percent of all the proposed operation of each carrier. So Verizon proposed to operate at 2 frequency bands for this proposal, and combining the total operation using the maximum power that's capable by the site, we find that at any nearby building, the maximum exposure level will be 0.43%, less than 1% of what the FCC allows for public exposure. And on a related note, 0.055% at ground anywhere near the site.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this?
Good morning. My name is Agatha Cajeas with Modus, an authorized agent of Verizon Wireless. I just came up here to show the noticing map that we submit to the city with our mailing affidavit. Even though it is tied to the nearest adjacent parcel for an address, we do base our notification off of the lat and long of the pole itself. So everyone who should be notified is. If you have any questions.
No questions, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Okay. Moving on to the next item, 19WR-00024 at 2736 Broderick Street. Do we have any protesters?
Good morning. My name is Roxanne Stachin. I'm a resident at 2730 Broderick Street. For orientation, this is the proposed location of the installation right in front of 2736. As you can see, it's essentially right in front of my residence as well. What caught my attention with this notice was this 98-degree azimuth, which I believe was the orientation of the antenna pointed, as you can see, directly at the residence at 2730 Broderick Street. Because of that, I did a little more research on this site so I could learn more about it. There was an error in the public health report stating indeed that this antenna is pointed at 98 degrees, but it says it's pointing east along Broderick Street. That is incorrect. Broderick Street runs very clearly, as you can see here, in the north-south direction. East is directly at a residential building. I believe this error is significant because it was made by public health in the assumption that the antenna would not be pointed at a residence. Typically, these antennas are pointed away from residential buildings, and so therefore I believe it was out of character with what they're used to seeing. I'll clarify a little more. This is an excerpt from the RF study, again stating that the antenna is pointed at 98 degrees, and it says it needs to be pointed in this direction for interconnection with other nodes in the network. Just a couple days ago, Exanet provided some additional information on these antennas to the residents who had written letters, clarifying that this installation will have 2 antennas, the relay antenna at about 17 feet height pointed at 98 degrees as we discussed, and a pole top antenna that is omnidirectional with no information about that, but I did do a little research at dictionary.com to understand that that means the signal will be in all directions. I think, again, this is very curious because this is a sketch of the building at 2730 Broderick, whose height is very similar to the other buildings on the street. As you can see, our building is 39 feet tall. This little diagram represents the installation with the relay antenna right about here, pointed directly again at these windows at the residential building, and the effective height that the antenna a clear 8 feet below the roof line of 2730. This obviously prevents a huge obstruction from this antenna. Furthermore, this building and all the buildings on this block have no setback from the street. 2736 in the materials is listed as 11 feet back from the antenna, so this would provide further obstruction for the signals. To learn a little bit more about these, I did some research so I could understand how they're typically installed. This is the Planning Department FAQs for small cell installations, providing residents information on these. Regarding the question about installations near multi-story residential buildings. On page 12, it states, and I'll read this, although the antennas are round, the antenna is typically set up in such a manner where the RF emissions are focused up and down streets and not directly toward the building behind the antenna. This would be consistent with other antennas that have been approved in our area. I came to the hearing last month just to learn a little more about this process and understand that they're typically set up to be oriented up and down the street. Also, I do understand we're talking about another location, 19WR0041, and this is a response that Sprint has provided to some residents about that, stating that in that siting for the same type of antenna, it says the proposed location is desirable because of limited obstructions in the area, allowing our antenna to effectively propagate a signal. So again, I would question that it would be hard to effectively propagate a signal when you have the antenna entirely blocked by a residential building that is, within feet from its tower. There are many sites within the neighborhood that could be considered that are allow for the east-west propagation, the 98-degree azimuth of the relay antenna, and are set back further from residential buildings. So I would like to open a dialogue with ExaNet so that we can understand the selection of this site and if there are alternative locations that would not be directly blocked by a residential building and would not require antennas to be pointed directly at residential buildings. And I'd also like to understand how the operation of this antenna can be potentially reviewed and modified such that signals are not required to be sent directly towards residential buildings, in keeping with the San Francisco Planning Department's description of the typical operation of these facilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any other protesters who would like to speak on this item? Do we have the applicant who would like to speak?
Good morning. Rick Hirsch on behalf of ExaNet Systems. I'm glad to respond to a number of concerns I've heard from neighbors today, including EMF exposure concerns and detailed questions about the antennas. Indeed, the FCC does set the safety standards for telecommunications facilities and requires wireless providers demonstrate compliance with those standards. This proposed installation has been reviewed by Hammett and Edison, an independent third-party engineering firm. They confirmed the proposal meets all FCC standards, and in fact, the H&E analysis indicates the installation would actually result in exposure levels very much well below the FCC's standard, most restrictive standard. The maximum exposure level that anyone would encounter at the ground level walking by the antenna on the sidewalk would not exceed 0.77% of the FCC public exposure standard. That's 0.77%, less than 1%. The maximum exposure at any neighboring building, including the protesters' building, is 18% of the FCC public exposure limit for an adjacent building, which is the nearest one is about 11 feet away. I also heard a concern about the secondary antenna on this facility. So the primary antenna is the pole top antenna. That's the antenna that is part of the wider mobile PCS network and propagation of Sprint signal. The secondary antenna, which is about 17, 18 feet above the ground, is called a UE relay antenna. And the model is an airspan, and it's a very small device that goes into the proposed equipment shroud. And what it does is, in lieu of there being fiber optic cables, fiber optic infrastructure in Broderick, there's no fiber optic cable, so we need some sort of what they call backhaul, which is transfer of data back and forth. And the airspan or UE relay antenna provides that data backhaul in lieu of there not being any fiber optic either entrenched in the ground or strung along utility lines. So all data that goes to and from, that would go to and from this proposed antenna goes through this secondary UE relay airspan antenna and it gets routed to a nearby, what they call a Sprint macro site, and a larger facility that has its own infrastructure and equipment in it. And so that's the purpose of that antenna. The airspan antenna has such low power, less than 4 watts, that in Hammett Edison's report, they discuss the public exposure limit, and you only reach that limit if you're 1 foot or less away from this smaller antenna. So your face, if you're more than a foot away from this airspan antenna, you are not at the public exposure limit. You're below the public exposure limit because it operates at such a low wattage, a low use of energy. It's a very weak antenna. And then finally, in regards to DPH, or Department of Public Health, they did review this site in detail, and they issued a memo on February 22nd stating that they reviewed the Hammett Edison analysis, and they confirmed that the installation complies with all of the standards. And I think I also heard a question about possible alternative sites. Honestly, Sprint and Extenet would have to go back to the drawing board and research any other potential nearby poles that would accommodate this facility. There are a handful of poles on Green Street that would be potentially usable. However, that would put the site in front of another charming historic resource, and really would not be any better from a planning protected or zoning protected perspective. Otherwise, if you have any additional questions, I'm here to respond to them. I also have Daniel Rowe from Hammett Edison, who spoke on the previous site, in the room, available to respond to any more technical or detailed questions about either the main PCS mobile antenna or the UE relay airspan antenna.
Okay, thank you. I do have a question about the orientation. So the protester did talk about a 98-degree direction. Can you describe or discuss that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the UE antenna just needs to be focused in the general direction of where the neighboring macro BTS site is located. And it is not a line of sight. I don't believe it's a line of sight technology, so it doesn't need to be viewing directly in its site the neighboring macro facility that it's transmitting to and from. It is indeed shooting at 98 degrees, or it would be pointing in that direction, and that is pointing towards the adjacent building. However, again, it doesn't need direct line of sight viewing of the neighboring transfer site. And in addition, it is so low wattage, as I mentioned, 4 watts is the maximum power it would ever emit, that it would have no impact whatsoever in terms of energy emission on the building 11 feet away.
Okay, so the primary antenna is pointing up and down the street.
Correct. The primary antenna is an omnidirectional antenna, so theoretically it has energy kind of flowing in a 360-degree radius in all directions, but the primary target for this facility would be north and south on Broderick.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
May I please just follow up?
Sure, come
on. A couple, just to follow up, I would like to open a dialogue with them because there's nowhere stated that this antenna would be oriented in the north-south direction. Other nearby facilities that I've reviewed are very clear in the responses. For example, a recent approved Verizon antenna, they were very clear that the antenna is oriented along the street. There's nothing written that says that about this antenna. Omnidirectional, the only information I can find on that, it sends signals in all directions. And again, the building entirely blocks this. In terms of, so that's what I'm really looking for, is understanding these alternate locations and understanding and having documentation of the orientation of the signals for this antenna. I cut this out of my presentation because I thought I would have 5 minutes, but for alternative locations. There are several in the neighborhood, and I do believe because the building completely blocks this antenna and it's not in keeping with planning department documentation explaining how these are sited, and also other responses by Sprint, I do believe it warrants looking at alternative locations. This is just one such example. Here's the proposed location here on Broderick. 325 feet away on Green Street, there is another location. This allows for the east-west propagation of the relay signal. Additionally, this is not a planning protected location. Broderick Street is. Broderick Street has water vistas, which are planning protected by the general plan. Green Street does not, and both of these buildings are the same vintage and historical significance. This one allows for the this site. Here's a picture of it. You can see the building is below the antenna. It would allow for the unobstructed antenna orientation in the easterly direction. And again, it has quite a larger setback. In fact, all of these alternative locations that we could discuss have much larger setbacks. This one is approximately 28 feet versus 11 feet, which would address all kinds of neighbor concerns and the other protests such as aesthetics and potentially noise. But because this is an omnidirectional antenna, it may allow for better signal propagation and less obstruction. So I do believe that Sprint should look at the other locations in the neighborhood and not just sort of say, hey, we picked this one and we're done, because I think there are other better locations from a siting perspective that would be in keeping with the information provided to residents by the planning department and how these are typically sited. Thank you. I appreciate the extra moment.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this? Okay.
Hello again, Daniel Rowe with Hammett Edison. Our firm also prepared the RF report for this Sprint site. So to clarify on the nature of the omnidirectional antenna and what Rick was talking about, so while the smaller antenna, lower on the pole, is a point-to-point relay antenna with very low wattage, 4 watts as Rick mentioned, the larger antenna at the top of the pole is an omnidirectional antenna to serve up and down the street. Typically, there's 2 kinds of antennas that carriers install on these poles, directional and omnidirectional antennas. Omnidirectional antennas service an area in a 360-degree radius in all directions from the antenna, while directional antennas can focus it in a single direction. So while the antenna that's being mounted on top of this pole is an omnidirectional antenna, what Rick was talking about is that the target areas for service are north and south down the street. Because the antenna is able to service in all directions, it's able to service those specific directions as well. And that's the nature of the omnidirectional antenna. I'm available if you have any further questions.
Okay, so I guess, so the Omni antenna does basically have beams in all directions.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Rick Hirsch again for Exonet. Thank you for the opportunity to come back up and respond. I hear additional comment from the neighbor in regards to possibility of alternative sites. So this Broderick is considered a quote-unquote excellent street view in the general plan. But if we did consider an alternative location on Green Street, we would get off of the quote-unquote excellent street onto a quote-unquote good street. But any of the plausible poles that we could use on Green Street, we've researched this, and apparently they would all be in front of other historic and architectural resources that are planning protected. So that wouldn't really put us or the city or the neighborhood at large in any real better position than this particular site. Again, if we were to consider an alternative site, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and research it. This particular site is the optimal site for network coverage in the neighborhood. And I just wanted to reiterate about the perceived impact to neighborhood character. The planning department did review this twice. They issued a memo back in the beginning of April, their approval recommendation, and they stated definitively that the proposal will comply with all zoning and planning protected standards. They determined that a facility at this location would be consistent with all the standards, would not reasonably affect, intrude upon, or diminish a city resource. They specifically determined it would not detract from the character of the neighborhood. And in addition, they issued a June 16th follow-up memo after correspondence with 2 protesters. And in the June 16th memo, they went back, took another look at the facility and its potential impacts, and they reiterated their original approval recommendation in the June 16th memo. They note that a pole top location, a pole top antenna can't be within or should not be within 8 feet of a residential window. This facility is almost 12 feet away from the nearest residential windows. And also, we want to also emphasize the very slimline, low profile, narrow design of this facility. It's about, the primary antenna is about 4 feet tall and about 1 foot wide that sits on top of the pole, and the accompanying equipment box or RRU shroud is even smaller than that, actually. It's about 3 feet tall and about 14 inches, 16 inches wide. They're very small. It's a very slimline facility, and we've worked tirelessly with both DPW and the planning department in crafting this design to be as minimal and unobtrusive as possible. If you have any further questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Okay. Moving on to the next item, 19 WR-00048 at 345 Spear Street. Do we have any protesters who would like to speak? Do we have the applicant who would like to speak?
Good morning, Luis Martinez. I'm with Mobility, and our site is adjacent to 345 Spear Street. We applied for the Personal Wireless Service Facility site permit under the Tier B designation. This is defined in Article 25 and Public Works Order number 184504, where the proposed location is in a planning or zoning protected location. The Planning Department has reviewed and determined that our application meets the Tier B compatibility standard. This means that our proposed location would not significantly detract from the defining characteristics of the planning or zoning protected location. There were some concerns with RF exposure. Again, we provide, when we submit our applications, the Department of Public Health reviews RF reports, noise studies. Both of these were provided by third party, Hammett and Edison. Department of Public Health reviewed those, and they found that our installation is compliant with the FCC standards, and they will not exceed FCC public exposure limit. And we respectfully request that you uphold our permit.
Thank you.
Any questions?
No questions? Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Moving on to the next one, 19 WR-00041 at 1201 Alamany Boulevard. Do we have any protesters who would like to speak? Do we have the applicant who would like to speak?
Hi, Luis Martinez with Mobility. This application is adjacent to 1201 Alamany Boulevard. And again, we applied for a Personal Wireless Service Facility site permit under the Tier B designation. As defined in Article 25, its proposed location is in a planning or zoning protected location. Planning Department has determined that our application meets the Tier B compatibility standard and would not significantly detract from the defining characteristics of the planning or zoning protected location. This installation is for Sprint. One of the arguments was saying that we were going to interfere with home appliances, but Sprint uses licensed radio spectrum that is designated and regulated by FCC for wireless communication, and it will not interfere with home appliances. With regards to RF, we provide reports by Hammett and Edison The Department of Public Health has reviewed those and found that our installation is compliant with FCC standards and will not exceed the FCC public exposure limit. Thank you. Any questions?
No questions, thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Okay, those are all the hearing items. Are there any additional public comments on any of the items? Okay, if there are no other comments, this concludes the hearing. Thank you, everyone.